everyone! I'm back with another article. I really enjoyed reading this one because I felt that it was super sweet, short, to the point, and very clear as to the message that I was trying to get across. And I feel like I learned a lot of really important information reading it, so let's just get into it. The article is titled Qualitative Exploration of Sexual Experiences Among Adults on the Autism Spectrum, Implication for Sexual Education. It was written on September 29th, 2015 by Jessica Penwell Barnett and Eleanor Maticka Tyndale. The abstract is broken into various parts, so the first part is context. The increasing prevalence of autism since the 1990s has led to growing demand for sex education that meets the needs of persons on the autism spectrum. Yet there is a dearth of research documenting the firsthand experiences and perspectives of autistic individuals. Dearth. Never heard that word before. For the method sections, it says, a thematic analysis was conducted of in-depth internet-facilitated interviews with 24 adults on the autism spectrum who were recruited from internet community spaces between November 2012 and May 2013. Inclusion criteria were self-identification as a person on the autism spectrum, being a U.S. resident, being aged 18 or older, and having the ability to communicate orally or through writing. Results. Participants were aged 18 through 61 and were living in the community at the time of interview. Most were limited to extrafamilial support. They were less likely than the general population to be heterosexual or gender conforming and were more likely to have experienced romantic or sexual debut after age 18. Participants' most common concerns were courtship difficulties and sensory dysregulation in the context of partnered sexuality. These concerns were exacerbated by inadequate and inappropriate sex education experiences. Participants addressed challenges by using sensory barriers, for example, latex gloves, planning when and how to have sex, negotiating alternatives to sexual scripts predicated on non-disabled experience, and practicing explicit and intentional communication. For conclusions, individuals on the autism spectrum would benefit from sex education that normalizes differences, i.e., in identities and experiences of sexuality, is offered throughout young adulthood, addresses disability-relevant sensory and communication needs, and includes practicing neurotypical sociosexual norms. Super cool. For background information, the article states, the substantial minority of instances in which autism co-occurs with intellectual disability, along with the perceived impact of autism on self-awareness and ability to communicate, has led many researchers to use secondary sources for collecting information on sexuality in the lives of autistic people. This has produced a literature on caregiver and public perceptions of the sexuality of persons on the spectrum. I find that to be super problematic because, like mentioned in the last article, if somebody is capable, I think it's important for them to be able to talk about their sexual experiences, their sexual wants or needs outside of the perspective or experience of their parents or their caregiver, because that's not independent. That's not what they actually want. That's not their actual experience. Have the ability to communicate, they ought to be the ones expressing their sexual experiences. We located 18 published studies assessing sexuality or intimate relationships in the lives of adults on the spectrum. Only 7 relied on data gathered from autistic people themselves, and all 7 were quantitative. That's extremely low. Previous studies have tended to focus on problem behaviors, such as public masturbation, non-normative expressions of arousal or sexual interest, such as persistent courting, masturbation with objects, such as pillows, or in response to non-normative stimuli, such as feet, and non-heteronormative arousal and behavior, such as, for example, same-sex. Rilmato and Rubel observed that many of these problematic behaviors are part of normal sexual development and common in children. Children grow out of these behaviors as they learn social sexual norms through peer interaction and formal education. I thought that was a super important thing to point out because I don't think it's right that many or most studies centering around sex education, when it comes to those on the autism spectrum, that it focuses on problem behaviors, because it only further stigmatizes the community. And I really like how this article referenced Romato and Rubel's research, because talking about the problematic behaviors, it is honestly mostly a normative experience of childhood development. And so children grow out of these / learn socio-sexual norms through peer interaction. So I think it makes a lot of sense as to why kids are more comfortable having uncomfortable conversations with themselves, right? And so if someone on the spectrum has challenges when it comes to social interactions, it makes a lot of sense as to why they may be missing or having a gap in this sexual knowledge, because who are they going to be able to experience this at such a young age? Persons on the spectrum are often excluded from these opportunities, particularly the social learning opportunities that are key to gaining knowledge about norms for sexualized or intimate interactions. The discomfort that parents and caregivers often feel about autistic individuals being sexual is reflected in delay or failure to provide sex education and concerns that its provision will introduce or increase sexual interest. I love the fact that this article pointed that out, because I completely agree with the fact that most parents are very uncomfortable with talking about sex with their kids, right? And so it may be even more stressful or more challenging for a parent with a child who's on the autism spectrum to talk about these things. But again, I don't like the idea that, oh, just because I'm talking to you about this, it's going to introduce or increase sexual interest. If anything, me or the parent disallowing the child to know about these things makes it taboo. It makes them more curious to go and see what that thing actually is, if not experiment within it. And so it's a little bit of a self-sabotage type situation, where if you think that your child isn't going to do it, or you don't want your child to do it, and so that's the reason why you're keeping the information from them, in reality, they are most likely at a higher chance of finding it out by themselves, right? And we want them to do that in a safe way, and sometimes they don't, and so that's why this is very problematic. Nichols and Bakley Smith found that parents of adolescents with higher skills commonly expected and hoped that the children would have intimate relationships in the future, whereas parents of autistic adolescents with limited abilities were likely to discount the possibility of intimate relationships and expressed greater concern about sexual exploitation and abuse. I think that's super sad and super wrong. I see on one hand why the parents are concerned about the sexual exploitation and the abuse, but what do you mean that you're more likely to discount the possibility of intimate relationships just because they have autism? Everyone deserves love. Everybody wants love, and so it's very sad and wrong that, generally speaking, people discount the sexual interest of those on the autism spectrum. Comparisons of autistic individuals with peers from the general population presumed to be non-autistic or neurotypical have primarily documented similarities in sexual experiences. No significant differences have been found between high-functioning autistic individuals, i.e. those with an IQ greater than 70, and their neurotypical peers in sexual experience or interest, formal sexual knowledge, marital satisfaction, or romantic functioning. Exactly. Alongside these similarities, however, significant differences have been found in sexual orientation. In a study using a multidimensional measure of sexual orientation, individuals on the autism spectrum scored lower on heterosexuality and higher on homosexuality, bisexuality, and asexuality than did a neurotypical comparison group. Super cool fact. The goal of the current analysis was to begin to develop an understanding of how autistic individuals describe their own sexuality and sexual experiences, and to examine the implications of those descriptions for the delivery of sex education. Interviews were intended to provide a big picture of individuals' sexual identities and histories, and how these were shaped by interactions with key institutions, such as schools and disability support services. Topics included receivement of support services and sex education, gender identity, socio-sexual experiences, satisfaction with sexuality and intimacy, perceptions of how autism shapes sexuality and intimacy, and desired supports for sexual health and hopes for research outcomes. Following clearance from the University of Windsor Research Ethics Board, participants were recruited between November 2012 and May 2013 through announcements. Inclusion criteria were self-identification as a person on the autism spectrum, being a U.S. resident, being aged 18 or older, and having the ability to communicate orally or through writing. Themes that emerged from the analysis were organized under 3 research questions. What concerns do autistic adults living in the community have about sexuality? How do they address these concerns? And how can professionals support autistic individuals in pursuing the social sexual outcomes they desire? For results, the beginning of the results start off with sample characteristics and distinctive features of sexuality. So, starting off with sample characteristics, the sample consisted of 24 individuals aged 18 through 61, and 22 individuals identified as white or Caucasian, and one of these individuals also identified as Jewish. For distinctive features of sexuality, the sample was characterized by considerable gender nonconformity. 13 participants endorsed a feminine identity, 6 a masculine identity, and 5 a genderqueer or androgynous one. This proportion or gender variant identities is substantially higher than what would be expected in the general population. I think that's super cool to see, and just thinking about it, generally speaking, I think that makes a lot of sense, because if those on the autism spectrum either struggle or don't care to follow social norms, social contexts that we've made up for some reason, why would they also then tether themselves to heteronormative claims, heteronormative activities as well? So I think that's super cool to see, and I think that was a really interesting fact to include in this study. 11 participants identified as heterosexual, and 3 of them claimed additional identities, including bicurious, asexual, and sapiosexual, meaning denoting primary attraction to intelligence. Finally, participants reported later sexual or romantic debut than that found in a previous study of the general population. Only 4 reported dating in high school, and the remainder had their first relationship experiences after age 18, 5 after age 30. I think that's super significant because, again, a lot of exploration happens in childhood, and so I think it's really interesting that these individuals on the autism spectrum, generally speaking, were having these sexual experiences much later in life, and so the experimentation and finding out what's right or what's wrong or what they like or what they don't like is happening at a much later age, when one could potentially say the stakes are higher, right? In adulthood, a lot of things, not to say that they matter more, but it's a lot more intense, and so I thought that was pretty significant. Common concerns. The first one was courtship. The delayed timeline for sexual and relationship initiation contributed to courtship concerns, especially for those who were older or identified as male. For male-identified participants, expectations for adept sociality were a key barrier to relationship formation and sexual experience. One participant remarked, "Yes, it's just like the Justin Timberlake song with the line, 'Funny how a few words can lead into sex.' So true, and also why sex is so very awkward and hard for autistic men. Autism influences how we can interact with others, and dating can be so hard." They put literally S-O-O-O-O-O. So hard. Girls are prone to fall for smooth talkers. And this was by a 43-year-old asexual man named Jack. That makes sense, yeah. I understand why it can be very difficult, and I think he explained it very well. The nonverbal and indirect, often purposefully oblique communication style that characterizes flirting and other early courtship behaviors poses challenges for most participants. CS, a 43-year-old heterosexual woman, expressed a common difficulty with flirting, relating that she has a steep learning curve with nonverbal facial/body cues. Again, you start to pick up these things in your youth, so like the non-verbal social type things, like should I put my hand here? If I'm at the movies, do I put my arm around here? A lot of that like type of like trial and error occurs like in childhood, and so it's really unfair, and it puts those on the autism spectrum at a disadvantage for not having those experiences. And so that's why sex education is so paramount, especially for this population. Many participants experienced difficulties both receiving and sending messages of interest or disinterest. Difficulty sending messages of interest were due both to participants not using nonverbal facial or body cues in a neurotypical way, and to ignorance and violation of unstated rules governing social sexual interactions. For example, one participant talked about how his non-autistic partner's expectations did not match his own. Quote, When my partner and I were first dating, he wasn't sure if I was into him. He was used to kissing on the first date and sex soon after, and it took a long time for me to want to try kissing, which I soon found out was really unpleasant due to sensory sensitivity on my face and lips and motor control issues with fine lip movements. I also was telling him that I was interested, but in a low-key, not exuding or explicitly sexy sort of way. So again, I think that quote not only is super brave to share, but makes perfect sense because there obviously could be miscommunication in this realm. The next common concern was sensory dysregulation. Every participant discussed struggles with sensory regulation that was frequently emotionally upsetting or physically painful. Many participants experienced sensory overload or found particular sensations associated with sex, such as sounds or textures, painful or extremely unpleasant. For some, this meant that all partnered sex was painful. For others, overstimulation and sensitivity to particular sensations needed to be managed to achieve a pleasant sexual experience. Often, management of stimulation levels was complicated by delays in conscious awareness of sensations or delayed ability to communicate shifting needs during sex. For example, M, a 39-year-old heterosexual woman, described her experience this way, quote, "My sensory processing differences make some kinds of touch too intense or even physically painful. I sometimes have trouble recognizing this in real time, when it's happening, and or communicating this to a partner. Sometimes I will realize that I've been gritting my teeth and enduring something unpleasant for 5 minutes or so without noticing it, before I get my act together to push someone's hand away or ask for a different kind of touch." The next common area of concern was inadequate sex education. Participants identified inadequate and disability-irrelevant sex education as a contributor to their courtship and sensory dysregulation concerns. Few individuals reported receiving useful sex education from their parents, and several said that their parents had never discussed sexuality with them. Parents most often had merely provided a book about reproductive biology. Vivian, the 31-year-old heterosexual and bi-curious woman, said, quote, "The only instance where my parents ever talked to me about sex when I was growing up was a little pop-up book my mom had showed me about reproduction, but that's the only time." Reproductive information was also the type of knowledge most likely to be provided in school. Some participants had not received even this limited education at school, whether because of general education norms at the time, because they skipped the grade in which it was provided, or because they were segregated into special education classes. Again, this puts those with ASD at a disadvantage because they ought to have sexual education knowledge just like everybody else should. Dragonfly, who uses assistive communication devices, had been sequestered in a special education classroom for much of public schooling. It had not received any school-based sex education. This participant's parents had deemed requests for information about sexuality inappropriate and conveyed only condemnation of sexuality. When asked what they had ever told the participant about sex, Dragonfly replied, quote, "Only to say that it's bad, not explain anything else. Found out about special parts of body from books." As a therapist, this breaks my heart because this is not client-centered. This is not advocacy-driven. This is extremely ableist to think that access to sex education is inappropriate for somebody just because they have autism, just because they use assistive communication. Like, mind-blowing to me. L, an 18-year-old woman who is asexual and bisexual, reported, quote, "I think autistic people should be given more specifics instead of the vague generalizations that sex ed sometimes delves into. I like specificity." I agree. The need for explicit sex education was also relevant to complaints about what had been taught. For example, participants identified graphic images of diseased genitals in morality tales as misleading. Rick, a 26-year-old heterosexual male, related, quote, "I felt as though I was being told that sex was extremely dangerous and I could contract hellish diseases if I wasn't careful. Yet they only told us, in a deliberate choice of words, to wait until marriage, which seemed to me quite odd. How did marriage protect against those awful diseases? I couldn't figure it out." I think who is this? Rick, so astute, because exactly, A plus B is equaling C. Just because we're waiting to have sex till marriage, how is that protecting me from contracting all these hellish diseases. It really doesn't, right? And also, I related to this a lot because I remember seeing these diseased pictures of genitalia in my own schooling experience. And so I think at the time, I thought it was just like, whoa, my God, that's so scary, that's so crazy. But now thinking back to it, I wonder if it was just like kind of like fear mongering. Like, you see what happens if you have sex, like these are the things. And I don't think that is the only or best or even a somewhat adequate way to disseminate sex education to children or to anyone, really. Finally, participants indicated that sex education often had not seemed relevant when it had been provided, largely because it had not covered topics of interest, or because they had not yet developed sexual feelings or were asexual. Several individuals commented on these aspects. Jack recalled, quote, "No mention was made about how you were supposed to feel about sex. How did you ask a girl out on a date? School talked about the mechanics of sex, but none of the moral or social conventions about sex. And no mention was made if you were not interested in sex. The impression is that you're supposed to be interested, no questions." That's not fair, that's not right. And again, very eye-opening account of sex education from an individual on the autism spectrum, because again, you're supposed to be interested, no questions allowed. Questions ought to be allowed, but that was the implication, and that was also the vibe that sex education has generally been given. When participants were asked what sexual health supports they would like to have received, they gave several common responses, which Dragonfly summed up in the following remarks. Quote, "Reasonable education about risks, methods, tools, and diversity in sexual desires, especially how to help make sex not painful or less painful, when bodies are not reacting right. And instead of just creating fear of pregnancy and death, using appropriate words, penis, vagina, breasts, testicles, etc., not kid words or polite words. Education about alternative or unconventional sexual activities. Education about differences between real life and pornographic fantasies, movie sex, book sex. Education about slang words people use to describe sexual activities, body parts that get used in invitations for sexual activities." I totally agree, because I feel like these improvements would improve sex ed just broadly speaking. These are all real life, transparent, authentic improvements to sex education, and I think one ought to implement these in their curricula, because everything that Dragonfly said and summed up makes perfect sense. Shared strategies for success. In the absence of adequate disability-relevant sex education, participants independently formulated a number of strategies for achieving desired sexual and relationship outcomes. A key strategy for maintaining mutually satisfying connection in the context of general anxiety or overstimulation was partner accommodation in the form of downtime, followed by participant-centered re-engagement. So basically just breaks for or to avoid overstimulation. I think that's an amazing strategy. The strategy of planning sex was mentioned by several participants. Planning was helpful for establishing shared expectations, increasing the likelihood of a receptive body-mind state, and preparing for particular needs, including those relevant to the additional disabling conditions that many participants and their partners experienced. In contrast, many conditions called for flexibility. The intentional, open, and explicit communication required to plan sex or maintain flexibility with regard to competing needs was the central strategy that emerged. Planning and flexibility, I think those are really important, and I think it just really drives home the respect aspect that comes to relationships, especially sexual ones. And so I really enjoyed that aspect of the article, that both planning and being flexible are two important aspects to healthy sexual relationships. Some participants successfully used direct contact barriers, such as latex gloves and blankets, to mitigate the sensory dysregulation caused by partner sex. Absolutely amazing. Tools or sex toys that make both or all participants feel comfy is absolutely amazing, and I really love that. Another successful strategy was described by Billy Joel, one of the participants, not the singer, who accesses physical intimacy in the context of her friendships, which serves as her intimate relationships. Quote, "I love hugs and hug people as much as I can. I really like long and strong hugs. I like holding hands with my friends, especially in strange places or when I'm stressed because that makes me feel a little bit better. And so again, another strategy is just alternate forms of intimacy. They can be beneficial, and I think that's really awesome. Overall, study participants' sexuality was distinctive from normative neurotypical sexuality in 3 key ways. First, participants expressed a considerable degree of gender nonconformity in both identity and presentation. Second, more participants endorsed a non-heterosexual identity than a heterosexual one. And third, delayed sexual and relationship debut was common. Each of these were experienced by participants as a deviation from the norm and exacerbated the inadequacy of available sex education. Participants' 2 most salient sexual concerns, courtship and sensory dysregulation, were linked with the 2 criteria used to distinguish autism spectrum disorder: social communication difficulties and unusual and repetitive behaviors. These distinctions are not considered here as deficits, but as disadvantages to pursuing romantic and sexual satisfaction in the context of ableist cultural norms and social institutions. Completely agree. Participants articulate several strategies for managing these concerns, including the use of sensory barriers, planning when and how to have sex, negotiating alternatives to dominant-abled sexual scripts, and practicing literal declaration. My boyfriend's playing video games in the back. I don't know if you can hear it. Go Arc Raiders. Strengths and limitations. The contribution of qualitative inquiry is its detailed description and potential to provide nuanced understanding of the experiences of research participants who have some shared characteristics. Here, this is an individual's own identification as a person on the autism spectrum. Generalizability is not a claim of qualitative research. All participants were living in the community at the time of interviews, most with limited extrafamiliar support. Most had some post-secondary or professional education and identified themselves as white. Participants' level of education suggests that they have IQs in the typical range. All data generated in this study were self-reported. Thus, all participants had the relative ability to report somewhat complex information in an oral or written form, a degree of skill that not all autistic individuals possess. The findings of this research should be understood within this scope. And then lastly, conclusion: generally inadequate, ableist, heterosexist sex education left participants with few resources to navigate difficult situations or capitalize on opportunities to achieve desired ends. To support comprehensive sexual health for autistic individuals, sex education should be disability-friendly, developmentally appropriate. Our findings suggest that for individuals on the autism spectrum, such education should be offered at regular intervals throughout the life course, particularly in young adulthood, communicate information factually, explicitly, and in detail, describe and allow for the participants in social sexual norms and skills, provide examples of the subtle signs of abuse and exploitation, and be autism spectrum normative by normalizing sexuality and gender variance, sensory differences, and delayed sociosexual milestones. Completely agree. Very straightforward. I thought that article was great, and thank you so much for listening. And if anyone has any comments or has any articles that you think that I should read or has any questions, please, I would love some interaction. And so thank you so much again, and see you in the next one.